Welcome to the Chronological Bible Journey, where we discover God's whole story one day at a time. I'm Derek. I'm here with Noah. We're going to be your guides today as we study Judges 19 through 21. It's day 96, so let's begin.
Yeah, Derek, today we are finishing the book of Judges, but we're not finishing the Judges era. So we still have a little bit more reading, a couple more days in the Judges era. But today is a reading. It's a difficult reading. You read through today's reading, it'll make you angry, it'll make you sad, disgusted. There's a whole lot of emotion that you can experience when you're reading today's reading. But I think it's important to remember and to know that just because something is in the Bible, it doesn't mean that this is what God has decreed. This is not something that God has ordered or even that God wanted. I think a lot of times when we read the Bible, we're like, well, why would God allow this? Like, well, God is allowing people to choose the experience the result of their sin, but that doesn't mean that this was what God wanted for his people. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember. In this story, we're talking about a people, I think it's important for us to remember, that have not been that far removed from God redeeming and freeing his people from slavery in Egypt. This isn't like we're talking about like 1,000 years later. Right. This is just a couple generations removed from what God did when he pulled people out of Egypt and out of slavery. But we see that they have fallen so far from the Lord. Mm-hmm. And it's an incredible thing how far they've gone. If you could read for us in the first words of the reading today in Judges 19:1.
Now in those days, Israel had no king.
So this is an important distinction that the author is giving us here, because while they don't have a king yet, and the next era that we're going to be in is the kingdom era, we'll see Saul and David and Solomon, we'll see the line of the kings coming in. But they're saying there is no king, but he's not just even here referring to just an earthly king. You see, they had a king.
Sure.
Yahweh was their king. The Lord was their king. But they have totally rejected him.
Yeah, they've chosen not to recognize him as that.
Absolutely. And later on, just on the other side of the Judges era, the Lord would say in 1 Samuel 8:7-8, they do not want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me, and they have followed other gods. And what we see today is a story in the book of Judges and the result of a nation that has rejected the Lord, one that has turned their back completely from the Lord and said, you are not our king. This is where it leads. This is the end result of God's people choosing to go their own way. And I believe it's really the end result of any nation that is going to completely turn their backs on the Lord. Yeah. You'll see it just ends in depravity and sin every single time. And when I was reading through today's reading, what I think is the most shocking thing here is it's almost parts of it are indistinguishable from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just with Abraham, when he experienced the people of Sodom and Gomorrah as he tried to rescue Lot, he begged God, say, if you find 10 righteous people, please save the city. And God's like, okay. And they couldn't even find 10 righteous people in this entire city. And that was a horrible thing. God destroyed it. But now we're looking at that same, an almost identical experience and encounter that happened not in some pagan nation, not in Sodom, but in Israel, in the tribe of Benjamin.
God's people.
These are God's people, and they are indistinguishable from the nations around them. And it's an incredibly sad, sad story. And we as we look at this story and we look at what God is doing in this story, he's continuing to allow them to fall into these sin cycles. He continues to pull them back up, but it seems like each time they fall into a new sin cycle, they fall deeper and deeper into sin. At the beginning of the book of Judges, we read these words in Judges 2:10. After that generation died, another generation grew up that did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that had been done for Israel. And today's story is the result of what happens when that generation completely turns away from the Lord. When Moses talked to the people about taking over the land, he warned them. He said, hey, God's going to do this for you, but it's not because you're so good. He said this back in Deuteronomy. It's not because you're so good. It's because they're so wicked, and God is acting on your behalf. So when it happens, when God saves you and rescues you and delivers this, don't be prideful. Don't think, oh, this is because we're so good. Look at us. He said that's not why God's doing this for you. But Moses' warning here to the people goes completely unheeded. And God removes the people from the land slowly, because God's people are obeying, but then slowly, we saw at the beginning of this book of Judges, they stopped pushing the people out and stopped doing what God had called them to do. And they allowed the people of this pagan nation to live among them, to be among them. And what we start to see is what the Bible warns over and over again, is that these people start to pull God's people into sin. When God's people and godly good things are around the things of the world, it's very, very rare for the godly person to pull the other people up. They usually get pulled down.
Yeah.
That's what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. Don't be deceived. Don't be fooled. What is it? A bad company corrupts good morals.
Yeah, we see it happen all the time, and we like to think it only happens in other people's lives, but if we're honest with ourselves, we see it happen in our lives as well.
Yeah. And that's what Jeremiah would later say, that the human heart is deceitfully wicked. Who can understand it? Like, we can't trust our own hearts. And that's why it's so important for us to follow the Lord and not look at a shortcut or look at an alternate plan and think this is a better plan. We have to know that the Lord is the one who has the best plan for us. We have to follow. And when we don't follow, this story here at the end of Judges is the result every single time.
Yep.
But when we look at this, we see in Judges, just looking real quick, Judges 19, we see this Levite and his wife, and they enter into the situation. They go into the city in the town of tribe of Benjamin, and the city, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, they take this woman and they abuse her all night, and they do all this, and she ends up dying. He cuts this woman up and sends her, and he's angry and he's looking for justice. And in chapter 20, all the tribes come together and they say, hey, we're going to deal with this. We can't allow this sin to live in our land. And now, as we'll see, and as we've seen all throughout the story of Judges, and we'll see through this even, they're no better than Benjamin. Now they're terrified and incredibly angry at what happened, but they're not following the Lord any more than the tribe of Benjamin. But they go and they confront Benjamin, and Benjamin will not give the people up. They refuse in their pride to follow the Lord and to give up and to admit it was wrong. And so we see the nations now warring, the tribes of Israel warring against one another. God had told them to come in and to fight against the people of the land and to push them out. And because of their sinfulness and falling away from the Lord, now they're just fighting one another and they're destroying one another. We see that there's 3 battles that take place, and the first 2, Benjamin wins and wipes out a ton of the Israelites. And the third one, God says, all right, when you go this time, I will give you the victory. And he does give them the victory. But then what's incredible is that after all this happens in 21, they start to feel bad for wiping out Benjamin, and they start to feel like, oh, maybe we went too far. And then read for us in Judges 21, verse 15, what the Bible says.
It says, the people felt sorry for Benjamin because the Lord had made this gap among the tribes of Israel.
Let me ask you this, Derek. What did the Lord make that gap between the tribes of Israel?
No, these are consequences for their sin.
Yeah. And these are actions that they chose. It's when you look at the 2 times that Benjamin won in those 2 battles, it's important to know that they did go to God. The Israelites went to God and said, ask questions, but they didn't ask God what they should do. They said, hey, we're going to go fight. Who should go first?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, Judah should go first. And then they get wiped out. Or this. And there was the 3rd time that the Bible said that they humbled themselves and they fasted and sought the Lord. And the Lord said, all right, now go and I will give you the victory. And now they're saying, oh, it's the Lord that has caused this. And just you see how quickly that they're going to turn this on the Lord. And then Judges ends with these words, these famous words. We read these earlier a couple chapters ago, but Judges ends with this summation of what life was like in those days. Judges 21:25.
In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes.
So you see how quickly this story is so depressing, so horrible, and what we see just time and time again, people turning to their own way. Now, I'll be honest. There's some cool stories in the book of Judges, and you have some things that we've heard since we're children.
Sure.
But this is a depressing book.
It really is.
And you look at the fact that this is a pitiful place for God's people to be. It's hard for us to imagine, how could this truly be part of the story of what God is doing? But we see that God always has a remnant, and that God always is able to work through the sin of his people.
Yep.
And in spite of the sin of his people, and is able to redeem and bring something beautiful out of death.
Yeah. It's so horrible, so wicked, but yet God, in his redemptive love for us, can redeem all things.
Yeah.
It reminds me when you were talking of what our pastor before Brother Steve, Dr. Adrian Rogers, used to say about sin. He said, sin will always take you further than you wanted to go, make you pay more than you wanted to pay, and keep you longer than you wanted to stay.
Yeah. And
that's exactly what we see with the Israelites. Sin will take over. And you know what? It's also interesting, just like Adam blamed God after they ate of the fruit in the garden. People come back, this is what the Israelites do. They're placing the blame. Nobody wants to take responsibility for their own sin.
Yeah.
And that's what God calls us to do, to repent of our sin.
And as we finish now the book of Judges, we're still in the Judges era. And tomorrow we get to experience a bright hope within the Judges era, as we meet a woman named Ruth and a guy named Boaz, and we see how God continues the promise even in the midst of this type of depravity.
That's right. Super exciting. Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you for joining us today. Please share this episode with a friend of yours that you think may get encouragement from it, and maybe they can jump on the journey with us as we continue on. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you tomorrow.